Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to say I'm an optimist. Bad times can be an opportunity, in fact. If you create the right ideas, if you promote these ideas, bad times can be, even crisis can be a good chance to do right things, actually. So I'm sure everyone here, and I know Nigel does, have some very strong opinions about what the government should do and what the government should not do as well, of course. So that's the topic for today. How can we promote our own ideas, really? How can we promote a better society through increasing liberty? That's the topic. And I've been interested in this for many years, actually. I did my doctoral thesis from a public choice Austrian perspective, explaining the growth of the state, explaining that all governments in advanced democracies and welfare states tend to become too big. Too high taxes, too many regulations, and things like that. So I devoted some time to constitutional matters, trying to figure out how we could constrain the growth of government. But that doesn't solve the problem, of course, if you already have a big government, and that's what we have in Sweden, and that's what you have in this country. So over these years, and I published different books on virtue ethics and educational policies, labor market policies, and so on, this puzzle has been with me. And, you know, it's not unique for Sweden, of course. It's an eternal thing, I think, in most countries. This is perhaps 30 years ago, but it seems very current, doesn't it? It's a lot easier to cut taxes than to cut costs. And if you just do one of the things, you will have a huge budget deficit, and that will create other problems in the future. And I think you're doing a good job at that right now, which is a crisis, a challenge, of course. But I will show that some countries have managed to handle these kinds of situations, and that's the topic. So the puzzle here is, how can we liberalize our advanced democracies and welfare states? There's a great need for this, but how can we promote reforms? And is it possible? That's the aim of this book, actually, to present a general theory of reform. Is it possible to construct such a theory? And I call this modern statecraft, and that's an art and not a science, even though I've done research about this, trying to figure out how this art would look like. And it's about implementing reforms that actually increase welfare in society, make society better, and that's what reforms are about. Reforms are not about increasing subsidies or welfare systems or anything like that. It's about making society better. So I restrict reforms to things that actually increase welfare, not raising taxes in those kind of reforms, but lowering taxes, taking care about budget deficits and these kind of things. And at least in Sweden and the US and many other countries, I'm quite convinced that what is needed are classical liberal reforms, reforms that actually increase liberty. So I've surveyed the literature of institutional change, and I've synthesized it in a number of ways, but I've also done an extended case study, comparative study of Sweden and Australia. And as Nigel mentioned, Sweden has been transformed in a very fundamental way over the last 25, 30 years. It's actually been a process of sustained liberalization, as I will show you. Very surprising to sense. No one expected this. And Sweden, as you know, had and still have very high taxes. They had government monopolies in healthcare, in schooling, and so on. Tax share of GDP is very high, but we managed to liberalize Sweden in many different ways. And it was so successful that the economists call it the next supermodel, a model to the world for how to do things, to promote growth, but also welfare at the same time. The Australian case, and that's the antipode to Sweden, that's on the opposite of the globe. It's a very different type of welfare state. It's not a universal welfare state, it's a selective Anglo-Saxon type of welfare state. And Australia had a very different system. Tax share of GDP is half of Sweden, and it was half of Sweden when the process started. But they had enormous tariffs, all kinds of barriers to trade. They had a very regulated economy. They had their own car brand made inside this closed economy. Wages were set in arbitration courts depending on what the male bread earner needed to support his own family. So there was no, labor market in an ordinary sense. But also, Australia managed to liberalize its society in such a dramatic way that it's a different kind of social model, I would say, just as in Sweden. It's an open, cosmopolitan, pluralistic society. Asians, many people go there, fantastic food, nice climate, as you know, and very astonishing. Not even during the financial crisis did they have a dip in the growth of GDP. Public debt was virtually non-existent. So, the question is, how did they do it? How could they manage to do these things? Very surprising, actually. I mean, both societies faced, as the US does and many other countries, enormous barriers to reform. The status quo bias was very, very strong here. You had different kinds of special interests, protecting their subsidies and benefits, regulations and so on, tariffs in the Australian case. You had cognitive frames, mental frames, ideas or ideologies supporting the old failing system. So in Sweden, everyone loved the welfare state. In Australia, they really loved, the protectionist British way of living there and only having white people from Ireland and Scotland coming there as immigrants. Of course, public opinion was a big problem in both countries. It's very hard to say that the emperor is naked, that private truth doesn't fit the public lies, as Timur Kuran and others have developed. Media logic, of course, enforce this. As soon as you take benefits away, people scream. But it's very hard, in fact, to promote classical liberal reforms, which often have a lag before the benefits come. Usually, it's reforms that make it better for everyone, not for specific groups. So there's a collective action problem here involved. But nevertheless, they managed to do this. And this is the first example. I will give many examples here. Early on in the process, in both countries, economic freedom increased dramatically, I would say. If you disregard the size of government, Sweden was one of the countries in the world that increased economic liberty the most, actually. So property rights, the rule of law, freedom of trade, sound money, regulations and so on improved dramatically. That was what happened, in the first phase here. But other liberalizations also took hold. So let me start with the Swedish case. It started with social democratic governments in the mid-1980s. So you had people like Olof Palme, Prime Minister of Sweden, quite a lefty, I would say. But they started with deregulating financial markets, credit markets, and so on. But not only that, they started to privatize governmental-owned businesses. They started to deregulate agriculture markets. They started with tax reforms, lowering marginal rates, cutting down capital income taxes, and so on. All kinds of reforms were made by the Social Democrat parties. Then for a short time, we had Carl Bildt, center-right government, introducing voucher systems, deregulating labor markets and so on, also in a substantial way. During this time, in the early 1990s, Sweden had an enormous crisis. So Sweden was a bit like Portugal or Greece today. We had a huge budget deficit, we had huge public debt, we had interest rates of 500%. Can you imagine? Like a banana republic in Central America, something like that. But slowly but steadily, we started to reform the system. So we took the crisis as an opportunity to do the right things. So then the Social Democrats came back into power and continued this process, introducing a new budgetary process, requiring a surplus over the circle. So public debt in Sweden is down to less than 30%. Having a very major pension reform, partly funded system, similar a bit to the Chilean system. Getting rid of, this is quite astonishing, in 2004, the left former Communist Party proposed, shouldn't we abolish the inheritance and gift tax? And the Social Democrats said, yes, let's do it, you know. And they did. Then the Reinfeldt government came into power in 2006 and abolished the wealth tax as well, you know, and continue these processes with choice and vouchers and so on within different systems. So that's quite a story, you know, and I'll just give you one example here. Sweden still have very high taxes. It's still a big welfare state, that's important. But you can see how this trend shifted, you know, the tax share of GDP. It was down actually to 42% something. Now it's coming up again. That's way above OECD average, way above the US, way above Canada, Australia, some other good countries. But still, this is something that, for example, Reagan did not achieve. Actually, we cut down the number of public employees, cut down public expenditures at a substantial level. And it was the Social Democrats that did it. For this process that took place for over 25 years, it ended in 2010, I would say. 17 of those years, we had Social Democratic governments. And most of the time, we had minority governments as well. So the only government that had a majority, that was the last Reinfeldt government, the center-right government. So how did they do it? Australia, a different story, but very similar in some ways. It also started out by labor governments. On the top here we have Bob Hawke, a former labor union leader who started the reforms in Australia, and Paul Keating, his finance minister, who also became prime minister later on. And as you see, they started with deregulations of capital and credit markets, a bit similar to Sweden, major tax reforms, competition microeconomic reforms, but also, very astonishing from a Swedish perspective, they favored firm level bargaining. You know, bringing it down to the firm level, no collective agreements anymore, getting rid of those arbitration courts in the process. After 12 years, they were kicked out of power, and John Howard here to the right, liberal nationalist government, stayed in power for another 12 years and continued the reform process. I was down in Australia interviewing him and a number of other people in order to understand the process here. And it's quite astonishing how they managed to do welfare reforms, work for the dole, privatization of the employment services, tax reforms and so on, fiscal consolidation in 2002. To give an example here, I didn't mention that in the here, but a major thing was, of course, getting rid of all these protectionist measures that seems to be becoming more popular in this country again for some strange reason. This is dramatic, you know. In fact, you know, the business sector in Australia didn't like this, of course. So it was the labor governments who were pro-market, while the conservatives from the beginning were pro-business, you know, protecting industries, protecting jobs and so on. While labor understood that it was in the consumer interest, it was in the interest of the welfare of the citizens to get rid of all these regulations and protectionist measures and subsidies and so on. So this is quite dramatic, you know. They did this unilaterally. Some was part, of course, of GATT agreements and WTO agreements and these kind of things, but basically they understood that free trade was a good thing for the citizens of Australia. So how did they do it? So here comes my first part of the theory of modern statecraft that I will present. I call this the reform cycle. And in my view, it's applicable to both the overall process over these 25 years, but also to specific reforms in specific areas. So it starts out on the left-hand side with economic social problems. As I said, in both countries, the former welfare state of Sweden, the protectionist state of Australia, had severe problems and policy failures. Globalization, many things made those models work in a disastrous way. But mainly because there were bad policies, actually. But that triggered an interest, of course, in developing new ideas, interpreting these problems, ideas that actually were productive in the sense that they increased welfare. They made society more free. So that's the driving force, in a sense, in this model. It's the ideas that actually improve society. That's what's necessary to get this going. But ideas by themselves don't do the job, of course. You also need some agency here, and that's the policy entrepreneurs. And I will explain a bit more about both ideas and policy entrepreneurs in a while. But you need real people who really promote ideas, develop ideas, and connect the ideas with different power, resources, and interests. It's not enough just to be idea people, but you have to mobilize interests, resources in order to really influence politics. So in the lower side here, you have what goes on in Parliament or in Congress in this country. That's a minor part of this reform cycle. That's the end of the cycle, in a sense. Then that's where you actually got the institutional change, right? Because when you change the policies, the institutions, that, of course, again, affects the economic social conditions, so you get this role. And if you get the virtuous circle, as they did in these two countries, it's possible to sustain such a process. But you have to do it in all types of policy areas, of course. I'll have a couple of examples later on here, but let me explain a little bit more about the role of ideas, because that's the core here. Without good ideas that actually make society better, and in this case make society more free, you won't have a reform cycle going, of course. And ideas can be basically two things, and that's very important. It can be causal beliefs about how the world works. Is market good or is planning good? Does it deliver? Is deregulation something that works or deregulation something that causes problems? This can be investigated by research, by governmental agencies, investigations, and so on. Extremely important. Beliefs of that kind, and this is a British political scientist, Peter Hall, who studied the Thatcher reforms in the 1980s. He makes a distinction between policy instruments and policy settings. So instrument settings, that would be, lowering the marginal tax from, in the Swedish case, down from 70 to 80% down to 50. Capital gains taxes from 70 to 80% down to 30%, down by the Social Democrats. That's a dramatic thing. But it's harder to really change the policy instruments. For example, abolishing wealth tax, inheritance tax, and so on, realizing that if we want to have a better society, perhaps more equal society even, you should use other measures in order to promote these kind of goals. So this brings me over to the other side of ideas, namely values, normative ideas. Those are a lot harder to change. But in the long run, I think that's equally important if you really want a process of liberalization, of welfare improvement to be sustainable. I'm not sure we managed that in Sweden and Australia, so that's one of the reasons I think the process stopped. So that's about overarching goals that Peter Hall mentions as his research. And altogether, this can be summarized as worldviews or policy paradigms, or if you want, ideologies. So the challenge, of course, for a reformer is to have your own worldview policy paradigm dominating the process. That's the challenge. And it's easier to change beliefs than it is to change values. The guys who really work with this is not only politicians, of course. So the guy on the top here, he worked for the Swedish Confederation of Industries. That was an organization that was very much pro-business, I would say, part of the corporativist Swedish model. But they became pro-market, and he was an individual who really made a big difference here. And I will explain more about this later on. The second guy, Bill Kelty, he was the secretary of the Australian Congress of Trade Unions. So he became a pro-market guy by saying we should favor consumers, ordinary workers should be able to buy imported goods. That is going to improve welfare of the citizens of Australia. Then you have a couple of economists here, both in Sweden and Australia, and we'll come back to this. Economists as advisors became very important. Some of them were kind of neoclassical guys saying that efficiency says that we should do these reforms. But some were more pro-market in themselves, and I will return to this question. So what they do, they use and develop these ideas. They often come from the outside. Both Thatcher and Reagan, the reforms, tax reforms were important. In both countries, Milton Friedman, Hayek visited. We had meetings with the Popperian Society in Stockholm in 1980, I think it was. Very important for a very small group of people, but these people turned out to be influential later on. And it's very important here to realize that policy entrepreneurs need to make coalitions with others. In the literature, it's called advocacy policy coalitions. So you can have people who actually have a different frame of mind but favor the same policies. You should collude with them in order to make reform possible. Very clear in the agriculture reforms that was implemented in Sweden in the late 1980s, for example. Both consumers, economic professors, housewives who demonstrated in the street against the high prices of food and so on, colluded in some way, and made reform possible. Now, well, they work to influence policies and so on, but what they do is that they use different kinds of reform strategies. And that's my second, I think, contribution in this book. So I have developed 3 kinds of reform strategies here that turns out to be very important in all countries. The first one I call Popperian, from Karl Popper, the Open Society, its enemies, falsification, piecemeal social engineering, you're familiar with all this. Then it's Thomas Kuhn, structure of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts. I will explain this more fully soon. And then you have, of course, Niccolo Machiavelli here, who wrote The Prince 500 years ago. Now, if you take the first kind of strategy, and remember, you should have the right policies from the beginning. So this is about how you influence others, what kind of strategy you use to really implement your policies. This is what we do at Ratio, basically. We do research. We produce new facts. We do investigations about different policies and so on. And that's what Popper really was after, you know. He criticized Marxism, Plato and other scholars who, you know, had these utopias and long-term things. So here, rational argumentation, scientific results, open public discussions, that's the way to promote policies. And that was important to both countries. But even more important, I would say, were the Kuhnian strategies about shifting, if you want, the mental frames, the cognitive frames of what really was the important things to do. Remember, that's the whole paradigm of ideas and values and overarching goals. This is the real challenge, I think, for reformers. And also, of course, the real opportunity. If you can frame a question in a different way, if you can use rhetoric, if you can use very striking example, very striking facts, not in the Popperian way by rational argumentation and so on, but to make people listen, you know, to make people understand the big picture. That's essential, I think, in these reform processes. And this is a very long-term thing. It's not something you do over time. As I said earlier, it's a lot easier to change instrument setting, policy instruments, and so on, than to change the overall interpretation of what's a good society, basically. In Sweden, this occurred in this crisis in the early 1990s. I think the elites in Sweden realized that the old system was totally failing. We couldn't keep on walking the same path on the same trail anymore. We had to really change the model. And they did, you know. That's why the Social Democrats actually kept on doing the liberalizing reforms for such a long time, because they had adopted, they had realized that a new interpretive frame was essential for improving the Swedish society. Now, in both countries, and I would say especially the Social Democrats in Sweden, used very Machiavellian strategies to implement these policies. So here it's about being very shrewd, not really telling the truth all the time, more of obfuscating, indexing things. Instead of cutting down benefits, you index them, you know. So you don't upgrade them every year when inflation goes up or growth goes up. Instead, slowly, they diminish, you know, as part of the welfare state. That's what we did with housing subsidies. That's what we did with social benefits and so on. Many things like this would go. Also, you have to be a player, and this is perhaps more important in Parliament, in Congress, than among most other policy entrepreneurs, but I would say you need to use these kind of strategies. Split the opposition, play off one group against another, compensate when you do reform, compensate some losers, but not all of them, you know, just enough to win, and make it happen. Well, this was very important to both countries. And especially, I think, among Swedish Social Democrats. In Australia, Labour governments really said, we want privatization, we want liberalization, it's good for the people. In Sweden, it was more blame avoidance, saying, oh, those other guys did very bad things, now we have to fix this up, therefore we have to cut down social benefits or something like that. And in the long run, if you have these kind of strategies, you run into problems. Also, the late Reinfeldt government, they won, called the Alliance, by having a strategy of triangulation inspired by Clinton in this country, saying that we love the welfare state, we love the collective agreements, we love the labor market regulations in order to win the elections, right? But once they got in there, they didn't dare to touch these things either. And they recruited the wrong people, and people started to believe that they really meant what they said, and yeah. So they ran into all kinds of problems, which caused the stop of the process in Sweden. They did good things, but using the wrong means for short-term ends may be very costly. I think this may be relevant for the discussion in this country as well, actually. Now, this is an interesting example from Sweden. As I said earlier, Sweden was a very dysfunctional, quite socialistic welfare state in the 70s and 80s. And the most radical proposal was to introduce something called the wage earners funds. So the Swedish labor organization, the Social Democrats proposed, or actually proposed, there was a law saying that all companies should be taxed. Profits of all companies should be taxed. Parts of the profits would go into certain funds administered by the labor unions. And in 30, 40 years, they would have taken over the whole Swedish industry. And that policy was actually implemented in Sweden. But that triggered a severe idea battle, I would say, where the Swedish business sector, and I mentioned Sture Eskilsson here at the Swedish Enterprise, Confederation of Enterprise. They recruited one of the top CEOs. You can think of the most prestigious CEO in the US becoming a leader of a coalition of industries, becoming pro-market. And they devoted resources to this. They had campaigns on buses with hockey stars, ABBA singers, you know. They mobilized members. They had demonstrations in the streets of Sweden. It was one of the largest demonstrations, you know, and entrepreneurs and business people never demonstrate, of course, but they did. But it took 15 years to win this battle, you know. But they did it for 15 years. And I think this was extremely important. It was very conflict-ridden, because when you said these kind of things, that profit is good, for example, you were considered an evil person in Sweden, you know, in the old welfare state ideology. But they changed that by taking on the discussion, really, you know, not being shy of telling what they really thought was just and fair. But it was a very long-term thing. Another result, I would say, of this long-term process is the tax reform that the Social Democrats implemented in the early 1990s. The proposals came from the Liberal Party, whom in the election of 1988 was made the main adversaries of the Social Democrats. So the Social Democrats said that you guys in the Liberal Party want to have this radical tax reform. You're really evil, you know. This is the most unjust proposal we ever heard of. 2 years later, they stole the same idea, colluded with the Liberal Party, introduced the same thing, even more radical. So this is a tax reform that is more radical than Reagan's and Thatcher's tax reforms. So the largest share of GDP was shifted around here by this. And in this case also, economists at the Ministry of Finance were very important. This is the Undersecretary of State, Erik Åsbrink here. The party leadership didn't really understand this. They didn't really prove it, but those people became idea-wise, very influential and managed to convince the party to go that way. And they used all kinds of argumentation. They said that this old system with high marginal taxes was utterly unfair, you know. And I don't think a Social Democrat in Sweden would say that even today, you know, but they did. So they managed to do this, and they changed so many things in a very Machiavellian way, compensating some, not compensating others, and making it possible to implement this very radical reform. A very Machiavellian kind of reform. Well-grounded, well thought through, well-researched, but the strategy itself was very Machiavellian. Now, there's a puzzle here that needs to be solved now. This reform cycle, these reform strategies may also be used for bad purposes, right? The conservatives, the socialists, the populists may, of course, use the same strategies. So how was it that the process, in fact, became welfare-enhancing and liberalizing? Why didn't destructive entrepreneurs use this? And how was the collective action problem involved in liberal reforms handled. So that's, I think, the hardest thing to explain in this book, actually. And I propose a theory that is inspired, in a sense, by Elinor Ostrom. I will explain that a bit more in the next slide. So it turns out that, as I said, some ideas were important. For example, the Thatcher reforms, the Reagan reforms were very important for both Sweden and Australia. In New Zealand, they had started a bit earlier than in Australia, so the Australian example became important for the Australian process. The New Zealand example became important for the Australian example. But in fact, the policy ideas, the good liberalizing reforms evolved in a process of what I call experiential learning. So the politicians, because the situation was very unclear, they didn't really know where to go, quite similar to today's situation. They experimented. They had consequences of the experiment. They looked around the world, they reflected about this, and they continually developed their ideas. I mean, that's often the case. There are no, blueprints for how to act, but you have to get the process going. And the process got going inside what I call the central zone. This is a concept I've taken from Edward Shills, a sociologist who's written some very interesting stuff over the years. And the central zone, that's not the establishment in a narrow sense. It's a wider elitist theory where different squares of society in themselves have elites, but if you win the central zone, you set a tone for what's valuable, what's the right thing to do, and that's what happened, in both these countries. So the labor unions in Australia, the cabinet ministers, the industrialists, slowly but steadily started to get the same idea of what to do, the same policy paradigm, to speak that language. And it was a large number of actors involved in this, and some weren't, policy entrepreneurs at all, or well known when the process started. In a sense, you may say that the Swedish Confederation of Industries or Enterprises constructed or built the central zone by starting think tanks, private universities, private radio channels, acting as policy entrepreneurs in this process. But that made the process evolve in this experiential way in a very Ostromian sense, She has the theory of how to govern the commons. And it's a bottom-up process where different actors in a polycentric system, in fact, manage to handle the tragedy of the commons, because people tend to do that sometimes, and that's what happened in these two countries. And this learning process took place within this central zone that I mentioned, Edward Shills' central zone. So it was a small group that learned, top-down process implemented it. And they won the elections, they were re-elected by implemented policies that actually improved welfare in the societies. Now, in order to handle this collective action problem, you needed, of course, some people who were devoted liberals. Some economists, some think tanks, some actors who really believe that this is the right thing to do without thinking too much about the cost or short-term benefits and so on. And this turned out to be the case. Some of them were economists, as I mentioned. So there's a literature about epistemic communities, very important theory that shows that sometimes professional groups, such as economists or other groups like that, can share values, worldviews, and so on, become very influential. Some were, of course, people like you in this room here, devoted liberals, who really believe that we're going to liberalize society no matter what the costs are in the short run. But that also was very important. So that's basically my story. So the theory of modern statecraft has three parts. It's the reform cycle with the policy entrepreneurs and the ideas. influence and power, resource, and interest, making the reform circle moving by using 3 types of reform strategies, Popperian, Kuhnian, and Machiavellian, but also working in this process of experiential polycentric learning within the central zone. So, thank you very much. That's it.